Do you want to learn the tricks that top leaders use to get the most out of themselves and their teams? Well, Naftali Hoff is here to help. Lead to succeed. Picks the brains of top leaders to learn about their challenges, insights, and best practices. Here's Naftali.
Hello, Lead to Succeed Nation. It's Naftali Hoff, and welcome to Lead to Succeed, episode 104. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Matt Blumberg. Matt is the founder and CEO of Bolster, a new talent marketplace for on-demand executives and board members launched in 2020. Matt was previously chairman and CEO of ReturnPath, the market leader in email optimization. Under Matt's leadership, ReturnPath won numerous Employer of Choice awards, including number 2 on Fortune magazine's Best Companies to Work For list. Matt is founder and chairman of Path Forward, a nonprofit whose mission is to empower people to restart their careers after time spent focused on caregiving. He's also the author of Startup CEO, a field guide to scaling up your business, and Startup CXO, a field guide to scaling your company's critical teams. Matt, so glad to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Naftali. This is lucky number 104, right?
Yes, absolutely. And a very auspicious time as well, as we're getting ready for the holidays over here. So I'm super excited to have this conversation. By the way, when I see an introduction like this, I almost don't know where to start, because part of me wants to talk about your business experience. Part of me wants to talk about the nonprofit. So why don't we just sort of take a step back and give you the opportunity to tell us your story? You know, how did you get here? You don't have to go all the way back, but, you know, to give us a sense of how you kind of carved out this path, especially as we're going to touch on later. There's so many different points along this journey. So I'm really curious about it.
Yeah. So we'll stick with the career, the arc of the career, and not go too far back. My first job out of college was management consulting. A wonderful first job if you're interested in business career and don't know what you want to do. I always say that I should have been willing to pay the firm when the firm paid me, because it was a great education. I then spent a couple of years in venture capital as an associate, which was really interesting to learn the sort of the ins and outs of deals, particularly around software startups. And this was sort of 1994, 1995. So it was the very, very early internet startups as well.
Yeah.
And that was a pretty clean lead to the thing that I did after that, which was after having been a consultant and an investor, I was really much more interested in being an operator and being the one inside the company making things happen, as opposed to the one outside the company, either advising or funding. So I went to work at a small cap public company called Moviefone. For New Yorkers who are listening to this, they may remember the old 777 film interactive telephone service, which went back to the late 80s. So it was a pre-internet business, but it was very much in line with the way the internet works. It was ad supported. It was interactive. It had an e-commerce component to it. It just predated the internet, and it was done through a touch-tone phone. And I was at Moviefone on the executive team for 5 years, 95, 6, 7, 8, 9, kind of internet 1.0, and was really very fortunate to sort of be in the right place at the right time. And woke up one day at age 25 or something, building and running a top 50 internet property at the beginning of the commercial internet. So I learned sort of business building inside of another company in those years. And after we sold Moviefone to AOL in 1999, I took a few months to figure out what I wanted to do, but then I started ReturnPath, which was my first company that I started. I ran that and scaled that up with a wonderful team and a great group of venture investors for almost 20 years. We got to about 500 employees worldwide and about 100 million in revenue. We sold the company in 2019. Along the way, we started Path Forward, the nonprofit you mentioned, which was kind of a side project inside of ReturnPath, and then we spun it out into a nonprofit. And then in 2020, a group of my friends and colleagues and I from ReturnPath started Bolster. So depending on how you count it, it's either my second company or my third company. And each step has kind of led to the next step.
Interesting, but they all seem to be in somewhat different areas, if I understood it correctly.
They are the movie business, the email business, and the people business.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm really interested on the connection to the people side of it because I do a lot of work with nonprofits as well. I'm actually a former educator and school leader, so most of my career pre-coaching was in the nonprofit space, and I still spend a lot of my time with nonprofits, nonprofit leadership, whatnot. And so I'm curious to know how the email optimization industry helped you, or was kind of like the birthing space, if you will, for this nonprofit, specifically with an eye towards caregivers. How did that happen?
It's an interesting question, and I would say there's sort of two through lines or consistent themes in my career. One is about sort of disruptive business models, but the other is really about people and human capital and leadership. And in a lot of ways, I always joke that Return Path could have been anything. It could have been a roofing company. It could have been, it could have been an insurance company, or it could have been an email company. I had lots of ideas for disruptive businesses to start, but one of the driving forces for me wanting to become an entrepreneur and start a business was wanting to create a different kind of workplace and a different kind of experience for employees. And the places that I had worked in the early 90s, again, consulting, investing, and then, in this interactive services company before the internet, were all, they were all wonderful, wonderful parts of my career. They all had some really admirable things about them, and I learned a lot of positive things from them, but I also learned a lot of kind of head scratching things or more negative things from the employee experiences. And it just kept striking me over and over again that the way in which companies managed their employees was not changing to keep pace with the type of companies that were being formed. So all of these businesses, investing, consulting, technology, they're all knowledge economy businesses. You're hiring smart, motivated people to work in them. And at the time in the 90s, a lot of these businesses were managing their employees with a great deal of control and a lack of trust, and things that I felt like, wow, these businesses are not getting the best out of their people because they're not treating their people well. So, I joke that Return Path could have been anything because the thing that I really wanted to start was a great place to work. And it happened to take the form of an email services company for 20 years. It now takes the form of a people-oriented business, which is probably a little more logical. But the 20 years of scaling Return Path really, in a lot of ways, was a learning lab for me and for my leadership team about people and about how to get the best out of people. That orientation, that was a long wind up to the pitch here, but that orientation led us to create a program inside of Return Path that was a return to work program for moms who had taken a career break. So our CTO at the time was the one that came up with the idea, along with our head of HR. They had been doing some work on unconscious bias and on building a more diverse engineering team, which is quite challenging. And they came up with this idea of a return to work program. We ran a few iterations of it internally just for us at Return Path, and it started to catch fire. And then it started to catch fire outside the organization. So we had other companies calling us, asking us if we could help them set up a return to work program. And after we did 5 or 6 of those for other companies off the side of our HR team's desk, we sort of called a timeout and we said, hey, this is obviously a market need, and it's really a wonderful thing, and we should lean into it, but we can't lean into it off the desk of the HR department of a technology company. So we created a standalone 501c3 called Path Forward, which is a little bit of a play on Return Path, Path Forward. We initially staffed it with someone who was a senior person at Return Path who moved over, and she's now the executive director. and it's kind of taken on a life of its own since then.
Interesting. Wow. There's a lot I want to ask you, but just one technical question before we go any further. Why did you choose to form it as a 501c3 instead of, let's say, a consulting firm?
That is a very good question. In some respects, it is a consulting firm, or that some of the work it does is consultative. We did have a long discussion about whether to, whether to make it a for-profit or a non-for-profit. I would describe it as a non-for-profit that we run with many for-profit principles. So we do rely on donations, but donations make up about 15 to 20% of the firm's revenue. Most of it is earned income from partners. So it's a nonprofit with for-profit mentality. But the reason we made that decision is we felt like the pressure we would have from investors if we were a for-profit company to grow would turn us into a staffing company and not let us be as mission driven as we really wanted to be. Path Forward is trying to do a couple of things that are very mission driven, right? Solving the gender equity issues in the workplace. And we just felt that a nonprofit was going to let us be what we wanted to be. And I think that was a good decision for us.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it was. It's just, it's a new way to think of it. That's for sure. And I think wanting to maintain control over what it is that you're after and not, we back in the day, you talked about how business used to be. So I know once upon a time, there was a very, very narrow focus on satisfying your shareholders and your investors and really making sure that at the end of the day, they were happy. I think business has changed a lot, and your story, maybe your mindset and your attitude and your values probably helped to spearhead some of that change. I know it's been happening on a global level as well, where companies are really trying to put their people first. And in so doing, create the kind of outcomes that not only make retention and interior, let's call it engagement, elevated and continually high, but of course it has then this great result that sort of makes its way to the market and whatnot. And so I'm just curious to know, because I know along the way in your intro, we talked about, or I mentioned the fact that your business was a great place to work multiple times, ranked as high as number 2. What did that mean to you? What did that look like? And just curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, you said the key phrase about 60 seconds ago, which is putting people first. And we actually kind of branded our culture at Return Path a people first culture. Mm-hmm. And that was really at the center of what we did as an organization. We had a deeply rooted philosophy from the beginning that that companies who invested in their people, that put their people first, those companies would ultimately attract and retain the best talent. They would, in turn, produce the best products and services for their customers and have the happiest customers, and in turn, would deliver results to their shareholders. So we had a slide in our company overview presentation that kind of had that flow to it. And our philosophy was really this people first concept was about giving a lot of freedom and flexibility in exchange for high performance. And at the end of the day, people, particularly knowledge workers, but humans, love degrees of autonomy and creativity in their work, and they do their best work when they're allowed to flourish and when they're allowed to think for themselves.
And was this, and I agree with you. I'm just curious. Did I cut you off, by the way? Okay, thanks. So what I want to know is this something, Matt, that you kind of quote came up with on your own? I know you talked about your experience in the consulting firms and maybe feeling at times that you were kind of boxed in, I'm guessing. Sometimes you have what we call industry norms, industry standards, and then somebody comes along. And I'm not suggesting you're the only person who thinks in these terms, but you have people who come along, one or multiple voices that come along and disrupt, right? They disrupt industries, they disrupt mindsets, they disrupt the ways that we think about and interact with our employees. So I'm curious to know, where did that come from your end of it? and how difficult was it to make that? It sounds like your team was on board, but did you find that in any way to be like people looking at you like, what are you guys doing? Or did you feel like it was really a ripe open space for this kind of pivot?
There's a lot to unpack there. I feel like a lot of the ideas that we executed on probably came from me at the beginning, but it wasn't just about me. It was about the leadership team that I was working with and the board that I had at the time that were supportive of going down that path to bring things to life and to iterate on them. And look, these things, as you mentioned earlier, in a different context. Sometimes society moves in different directions. So, in 1999, I wasn't the only person thinking about things like this. There was a very famous PowerPoint that got circulated, I think, in 2000 that was Netflix's culture deck. And so Netflix and Return Path were about the same vintage. Netflix, obviously, much bigger, more famous company, that happened as we were implementing a lot of these things ourselves. So we were certainly not the only people that came up with this. And I think the answer to your second question, which was sort of how easy was it, is an interesting one, because you would think in some respects, it would be easy, or that the resistance would have come from investors,
right,
as employees. Our investors were actually quite supportive. And as long as we were doing a good job at work, they weren't micromanaging how we were running the company. A lot of the resistance that we had over the years, and there wasn't tons, but a lot of the resistance we had over the years came from kind of the management layer in the company, and even some of the leaders in the company, because they had grown up and been trained as managers in places that were a little more command and control, and had reflexes that were developed in those environments. So I remember, I'll give you one example. We, when we started the company, again, this is 1999, we had a fairly traditional vacation policy. It was a generous one. It was 3 weeks plus a bunch of bonus days. And at the time, 2 weeks was a standard. But it was still a vacation policy. And a few years in, I said, you know what, this is wrong. This is not consistent with the people first culture of freedom and flexibility in exchange for high performance. And if we're not counting the hours that people do work, why are we counting the hours that people don't work? So we moved to what we called an open vacation policy, which again now is a little more commonplace, although it's still not a standard anywhere. And the open vacation policy was, was essentially an unlimited vacation policy, although you had to get your job done and you had to get it done well. So it was bounded by your ability to execute. And we didn't really track days and hours off, and we encourage people to take as much time off as possible.
Were they tethered to an office, or did you also have that kind of mindset?
Yeah,
I know you didn't have the technology then as you have today.
Exactly. I would say we always had a distributed workforce. So we always had offices in multiple places and people who worked from places where we didn't have an office. And our policy around working from an office, if you had an office to go to, was always a fairly flexible one. It wasn't the way things are now post-pandemic, for sure, but it was a flexible one. Like, you could work from home if you wanted to work from home or needed to work from home. And that was another one, along with moving to open vacation, that had a lot of managers really sort of keyed up. So we did get some resistance there. And ultimately, we got everyone over the hurdle, and we said, look, let's manage this by exception on the back end. Let's not manage it by fiat at the front end. And, I think we probably had this policy at Return Path for 15 years of open vacation. One time ever did we have to tell someone they were taking too much vacation out of 500 employees.
I'm really interested.
We have the same policy at Bolster now. We're a small company now because we're a startup.
Right.
We don't even think about it anymore. If anything, we have to tell people to take vacation because they're working too much.
Interesting. So I'm interested in that manager transition, that training piece, the mindset there, because oftentimes, like you mentioned, Matt, people have a certain way of developing, and so they often need to be coached in a different direction. you made it seem like all your people stayed with you and they made that transition. Is that more or less a fair understanding, or did you need to, cycle through some of your management level in order to get the right people back on the bus?
Yeah, I would say the thing we got very good at over the years was hiring very strong uh, people at sort of the middle level of management, kind of manager director level, who had been trained elsewhere but hadn't been weren't totally set in their ways. They hadn't been doing what they've been doing for 20 or 30 years, and we were able to sort of put our stamp on them as a manager and a leader. We invested extensively in management and leadership training and development. And that was a very good formula for us. We did have a few senior people who did not grow up in our system, who came in and loved it and embraced it and flourished in it. And we had some senior people who came in who had a hard time with it and who ended up cycling out. So it was a mix of things. But the formula that worked well for us was kind of hire in the middle and grow the leadership talent ourselves.
Nice. Okay, so let's talk for a moment about Bolster, because I am interested in hearing about on-demand executives and board members. First of all, who needs such a service typically, and is this a growing trend?
Yeah, so Bolster, let me back up for a second and just describe the business. So Bolster is an online marketplace. So it functions the same way Airbnb does or Uber does, right? It's got buyers and sellers in a marketplace. And we exist to help founders and entrepreneurs and CEOs access talent in a better, different, faster, and cheaper way at the executive level. So the marketplace helps principally startups and scale-ups and private companies, although we have done some work for larger public companies. The marketplace helps companies hire executives, and that could be for what we call an on-demand role. And I'll come back and answer that question in a minute. So on-demand would be anything that's like a 1099, not a W-2, and not an equity role. So it's a project, it's a fractional executive, it's a mentor, it's a coach, it's an interim executive. We also do connect people for full-time roles. We connect people for board of directors roles, and we connect people for networking and high-value introductions as well, where money isn't necessarily changing hands. There are several trends at work that are putting wind in the sails of the business. One of them is that the world is moving to a more flexible work environment, right? Some of it came from COVID, right? People can work from anywhere and video is pervasive, et cetera. But the gig economy is not new, right? The Uber is 12 years old or 13 years old or 14 years old now as a business. And people have been talking about working gigs for a long time. And what's happened over the last decade is that gig work has moved upstream. So, I think 20 years ago, and this is a little bit cartoonish, but 20 years ago, if you were a fractional executive or if you were an executive consultant, you were either retired looking to stay active, or you had a hard time getting a full-time job. Now, if you're a fractional executive, it means you have earned the right to work on your own terms.
I love that. I love that switch that you just referenced.
It's incredible. The talent that's out there that wants to work, wants to contribute to companies, wants to work maybe even full-time if you add it all up, but wants to do it piecemeal. They don't want to be tethered to one desk, to one company, to one boss, or to one way of thinking. And we have tens of thousands of executives in the Bolster network. And I remember one of the ones that we recruited very early on, probably one of the first 100. I was talking to her about her journey, and she was a human resources professional. She'd been a chief people officer at a bunch of companies full-time, and then had just decided to go fractional. So she had 2 or 3 clients. And I asked her why, and she said, well, it all started when I took time off between jobs, and my family and I moved to the south of France. And then I got a call from a headhunter that there was an interesting job opportunity for me. And I talked to the company and I said, but I'm really happy here in the south of France. I don't want to move back to Chicago, wherever she was from. And the company let her work from there. And she just like the light bulb went on. She's like, oh, I can live in Provence. And I can still be a head of HR for a company in Chicago, and I can do it 2 days a week, and then I can spend time in the south of France. And she just said, I'm never going to do that again. I am never going to, go back to the rat race again. So not everyone is like that, but there is a growing trend around,
Yeah.
around work on your own terms. There's also a growing trend around coaching and mentoring, particularly in the startup world. There's a big trend around diversity in the boardroom. And all of those things are fueling our business because we do have a very large and diverse pool of talented executives, and we make it easy for companies to access them on their own terms.
Cool. I love it. It's actually interesting, Matt, because I was going to ask you about something you talked about a while ago when you talked about your own transition from consultant to going in-house, let's call it. And I had the opposite journey. I was tethered to a building. I was an educator. So even though I worked in multiple institutions, often concurrently, wherever I worked, that was the place, so to speak. And then was a headmaster of a school, for sure, that was my entire focus, my location, everything. And then I said to myself, I want the freedom. I don't want to be tethered to one building. I don't want to be answering to this one board of directors who did not always make my life so simple and pleasant and whatnot. And so I wanted the freedom and the flexibility to serve on different levels, different kinds of clients, different ways. Every day I'm somewhere else, that kind of feeling. And so I was curious about your almost like reverse approach, where you were on the outside looking in and you had this desire to become part of something specific, right? And then, of course, things have changed for you. And now you're talking about these fractional executives and whatnot, who I guess, talk about the rat race and whatnot. They've been in one place for a really long time, and now they want that freedom, whether it's in France or just from their living room, wherever they're located. So I'm just curious about how you see those kind of like opposite ways of thinking of things.
It's really different to be 21 years old and an analyst at a consulting firm, and being, mid-career or late career, and being a consultant or a coach. They're both consulting, but they're very different jobs. The job of the 21-year-old analyst, is to work 100 hours a week. and when you work at a consulting firm, you do have clients, but you really work in a job at the firm. So I think it's, look, careers have arcs to them. They have different seasons to them. And, when you're in that sort of first 5 years out of college, you don't really have enough expertise to go out on your own and do much of anything. So even if you wanted to do that, you could, but those are years where I found learning was the most important thing I could do. And it's hard to learn on your own.
I hear it. Yeah, that is very true. And sometimes in my work, I feel like I just wish I was surrounded by a lot of really smart people right here, right now. And that is something that I miss without question. All right, my last question of this segment, I ask it of all of my guests. I actually have, I'm on the tail end of a journey to put a productivity book out to market. I already did an ebook and tons of other writing and whatnot. But I wanted to ask you for, actually, you know what? My apologies. I'm getting ahead of myself. This segment, I want to ask you a question about the biggest mistake you've ever made, how you've overcome it.
So I'll give you two. I'll do one of omission and one of commission.
Love it.
So I think the biggest mistake, we're talking about business here. The biggest mistake I ever made in business was not selling Return Path when I had an opportunity to sell it, like in 2013. So 6 years before we sold it. In hindsight, that was a big mistake. We would have made much more money in much less time. And the sin of commission, and I'll come back to lessons because I think they're probably similar. At one point along the journey at Return Path, we took growth capital from an investor that turned out to be a real problem, like a very, very poor choice of investor that created numerous problems for us as a company, for us as a board. We ended up having to buy them out. It was very unhappy, and it was a massive distraction. And the lesson I took away from both of those things is that when you're building a business, you're doing several very different, but obviously connected things in parallel. And you actually have to be good at all of them. You have to be good at building the business, right? Finding product market fit, having vision, dealing with your customers, dealing with the operations of the business. You also have to be good with people. And you have to know how to mobilize the army. But then you also have to be good at the corporate stuff. You have to be good at managing the cap table, at managing the balance sheet, and at sort of thinking both big picture and small picture at the same time about those things. And some of those things are hard. Market timing is anybody's guess. But both in the mistake of not selling the company when we probably should have, and of taking money from a bad investor, just taught me that third track, you really have to pay attention to that and get as much outside advice as you can on that track too.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, getting the outside advice, the mentorship, those are all critical pieces. And I'm sorry about the reason I asked this question is because when my listeners, just people in general, when they see successful people, so we oftentimes think, well, they just have some special gift, they were maybe on the fast track. And when we hear about mistakes, we recognize that we're all human. We all have those moments where we second guess, we wonder, should have, would have, that kind of thing. And the reality is, that's part of the journey. That's really part of the journey. And so let's transition over here to rapid fire. And I'm curious to know, Matt, who is a person in particular that really inspires you?
I'm very inspired by my wife.
Okay.
My wife is, like you, an executive coach.
Nice.
She's a CEO coach. And I am truly inspired by the sheer number of important things that she can seem to get done at the same time.
Cool.
Whether it's running the house and raising the 3 kids, which I'm a participant in, but she's the lead. Being a CEO coach and managing her clients, or serving as a board member, and in lots of cases, the chairman or president of multiple nonprofit and civic boards at the same time. It's absolutely remarkable.
Okay, so we're going to just keep the rest of these nice and tight here.
Sorry.
The worst advice you've ever received.
Worst advice I've ever received was to sell Yahoo stock in 1996 or 7.
Okay. If you could put something on a billboard for everyone to see, what would it be?
Find joy in something today.
Love it. And finally, a productivity tip that helps you to get more done.
I type 120 words a minute.
So everybody should just learn to type a little faster.
We spend an awful lot of time typing.
Okay, so tell everyone, please, Matt, how they can find you, how they can connect with you, learn more about your work, and just get more of your wisdom and inspiration.
I have a blog, which is startupceo.com. I don't post it. I post probably once a week.
Okay.
I am very easy to find in general. Email is just matt@bolster.com. And I would encourage anyone that's a senior executive to take a look at Bolster. And it's free to sign up. It's free to search. It's free to join. And it's a great community of executives.
Yeah, you certainly have piqued my interest. Okay, so before I let you go, please leave us, Matt, with one final life lesson.
Be open to new ideas.
This one you could elaborate on if you wish.
I find that that is not so common. People get set in their ways. People get rigid. People think about things the way they think about things. People get attached to a tribe and tribal thinking. And I think all of those things are destructive.
I hear it. All right. Well, it's really been a pleasure speaking with you. And as I alluded to at the beginning of our conversation, recording this just before the Jewish New Year. So wishing you a Shana Tova, and to everyone listening as well. And I'm really looking forward to sharing this content with my listeners. You've given me a ton, and thank you, Matt. It's really been a pleasure.
Nice to talk to you, Natali, and Shanatova to you as well.
Bye-bye now.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode and for investing in yourself so that you can lead to succeed. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show. Your feedback gives the show more social proof and encourages more folks to listen.